Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 104, The Open Door Project. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And our guest today is George Wielechowski. He is a graduate of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and is the founding director of the Open Door Project, which is a project under the auspices of Wielechowski, the organization whose founder, David Siegelman, we interviewed early on in the history of this podcast and that we've talked about quite a few times over the course of the 2 years that the podcast has been going. Remember that Wielechowski is an organization that's basically about subsidizing the rent of young Jewish adults who, in return, create Jewish programming in their homes. It's added various elements over the years that help those folks who are living in the houses learn more about Judaism and find their Jewish voice, etc. The Open Door Project is something of a departure from Wielechowski's existing model, and it's really fascinating to get into the question of why it is that they're launching this program. The Open Door Project basically is an incubator, supporter. It creates community, gives funding, consulting, organizational help to a number of spiritual entrepreneurs who are trying to get a new kind of Jewish spiritual organization off the ground. We're really excited that over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be talking with the 4 members of the Open Door Project's first cohort. The Open Door Project is currently in the process of seeking out its second cohort. The project has been up and running for about a year already, and it's really quite a fascinating initiative. We're really looking forward to getting into the details about it with George and to hearing about the particular organizations with their founders in the weeks ahead. George Wielechowski also has a fascinating personal story that we're going to get into in this conversation. Thank you so much for being with us, George, and welcome to Judaism Unbound.
Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate it.
I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit of a sense of what the Open Door Project is, and then we'll go into sort of more, I think, sort of how it happened.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I remember, just briefly, I remember listening to that podcast when I was trying to get to know who David was. It was kind of an awesome way to, besides talking to him all the time, an awesome way to get a sense of his passions and how he came about his work. So look, the Open Door Project is really at its heart, it's a learning community. What we tried to do in working with David was to envision what it would look like to create a small and intimate community where entrepreneurial rabbis and cantors, and I think eventually spiritual leaders of all stripes, but we're spiritual leaders who are trying to build break-the-box models of what it means to be in community, what it means to have lives infused and inspired by Jewish spirituality, a community where the folks that were doing that really brave and I think still marginal work could come together, get very significant investment in their projects. Equally as important as that significant investment, get a space where they could be themselves with peers, where they could be who they are with peers and struggle together in the early days of starting something up from scratch. That was really the key. That was the white paper that David, sent me when we first started talking about this. Could a community like that be created where these folks could, again, get the funding, but more probably equally importantly, get the community of practice that made them feel like, A, they weren't alone, and that B, they were going to build a kehillah, their own community, right? Their own sacred community around doing this work. And I think that I'm lucky enough to now have this amazing gig where I kind of look around the country and try to find the disgruntled dreamers that are hopeful, not knowing the ledge they just have stepped off of, right? Not knowing if their foot's going to meet solid ground or not. And that is a place that is spiritually scary. It's emotionally scary. It takes a certain kind of brave person. And also because of the kind of, you're putting yourself out there. And so that requires, I think, community, and have you get a sense that you're not doing this work alone. We have a sense in the Jewish world sometimes that the less connected are the margins. I would argue that they're the majority. And so the folks who are supposedly doing marginal work are actually working to serve the largest majority in Jewish life.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I mean, maybe it's a better thesis statement of our podcast than like one that we could come up with. So I appreciate that, but I want to get a little deeper because there's some pieces you've brought up so far that are really interesting to me. One is this word bravery that is popping up, and I'd love to hear from you a little bit more on that front. Like, what is, so you've said people are putting themselves out there. What is so challenging about this? And what are the like particular concrete kinds of risks that people are taking as they create these micro communities? And also, since we've been talking a little bit abstractly so far, like what kinds of communities are these? Like what does this look like in comparison to what we might think of as more normative or mainstream kinds of Jewish communities, if that makes sense?
In terms of the bravery, I think that the deepest spiritual connection comes from, finding yourself that teacher. And I think that what I've seen of the many, many rabbis I've spoken to in doing this work, we spoke to nearly 60 rabbis before we launched the program. Just in this current application cycle alone, we've spoken to probably another 30 new voices, new entrepreneurial voices out there. And what I've seen is that they're ultimately teaching themselves, meaning that I had in rabbinical school, Rabbi Sarah Lev, who is just an inspiring and amazing teacher, said to me once, all you ever really teach is yourself. The 4 entrepreneurial rabbis that Open Doors partnered with in the first cohort have to give everything about their approach to Jewish life to the world. And that's not something we all have to do all the time, right? You have a certain tradition or a certain minhag, a repeated tradition in your life that you keep that has a Jewish framework on it. And you don't have to explain that to anybody.
Yeah.
Whether it's halachically oriented or not, or whether you take a super mindful approach to it or not, or whether you just do it and that's just the way it is. Like, you don't have to explain it to anybody. These teachers have taken something that's grown inside of them personally, and manifested it in the world. For instance, so now there's the context, right? So imagine, but I just want you to imagine that for a second, like taking your deepest held spiritual and emotional self and beliefs and lived experiences, and putting that out in the world and thinking that has value for others. It's like an artist, right, who puts their first piece of written word art out there, their first sculpture, their first painting. It's brutal in some ways, but it's also, to do it, you have to be brave enough to say, I do have something to give the world. We didn't know what that bravery was going to look like, frankly, when we started the Open Door Project. We knew that we were inspired by the GEN, right, the Jewish Emergent Network. These are 7 communities spread around the country, the oldest of which is, I think, 14 years old, and the youngest of which maybe is a half a decade old, or maybe a little less.
A couple of them, for those who've been listening for a while, The Kitchen, who we spoke to early on, and Labshul are two of the ones that are part of that we've spoken to. So
the context for all of this is to say that we had this proof of concept out there, or these proofs of concept, that you could go out there, you could build something that was, in some of these models, significantly different than a traditional shul or synagogue, and that not only would people come, but they would be just inspired, right? They would walk through the door and feel something they had not felt in maybe forever. So with that proof of concept out there, but with also the spacing of 5 to 10 to 15 years since some of those communities had come out, right? We launched last year not knowing what we would see. And then we got to talking more and more to these rabbis that eventually applied. We had 31 applications the first go around, and these folks walked through the door who had broken the box for us, and for me at least. I'll speak for myself again. Broken the box for me about what this could look like. So we had eventually our first cohort wound up with these 4 amazing rabbis. One from your hometown there in Chicago, Rabbi Ari Malfik, was really just creating, I think her innovation is kind of like, hey, we can bring Judaism into your home again and have every one of your human needs align with a Jewish doorway to meaning. And that's legitimate, and that's enough. So that's Rabbi Ari Malfik. Rabbi Adina Allen and her life partner and executive director and co-founder Jeff Kazowitz up in Berkeley, California, have created an artistic, creative expression studio space that blends deep Jewish learning, prayer, and ritual with sculpture and creative writing and drawing, fine arts of all kinds. That has everything from regular 20, 30 person crowds showing up at 8 a.m. to, and I was there one morning, to celebrate Rosh Chodesh and chant the beginning of the month and chant some traditional Hallel, some psalms of praise, and also do a creative writing experience around what the beginning of the month can mean. And the place is packed. And they can go off and lead a 500 person High Holy Days this past season. Right. We also have Rabbi Dan Horowitz in Detroit, who in a community of, I think maybe around 60,000 Jews, has found a way to move the kind of the spirits and minds of, I think it's something like 2,500 young Jews and folks who are, adjacently Jewish, which is a term I picked up in doing this work, which I love. Folks who make their lives with and around Jewish people, but might not have that particular identity claim for themselves. And then finally, we have, Rabbi Dan Ain in Brooklyn. You guys will sit with him soon. He's just such a talented presence, really, is what I have to say. Like, he's got a way of drawing people into deep, deep conversation just by his gift of presence and spirit when you sit with him in a space. And so he's taken this over the last many years and realized that he could bring together a community of artists and creatives and folks who wouldn't necessarily walk through other doors in Jewish life and give them a space inspired by what speaks to them. One of his very popular experiences, he brings together folks for something called a Friday Night Jam, where he will make space both for Jewish ritual, meditation, candle lighting, things like that on a Friday night to welcome Shabbat, as well as bring in popular musicians from the past, 10 or 15 years, Lisa Loeb and other names that you would definitely know, bring them in for both kind of a music set, so you get a bit of spirituality through music, but also a very deep conversation about Lisa's spiritual journey and about how her, Jewish identity infuses her work and how her work is an expression of that in ways that we normally, might not hear. And these are the amazing expressions of community and spirituality that we found, right, in this search across the country. And I'm just amazingly excited to see what's going to happen this year. But the one thing we walked away with is, whoa, this is very different. This is very different from what happened with the Jewish Emergent Network in great ways. And we feel like, it's an extension of that really important, groundbreaking work that they did to say that Jewish community and Jewish spirituality don't have a single definition. So let's figure out what the variety and the spectrum of definitions are.
Do you think that what you're describing is kind of going sort of in a line of sort of the adjacent possible from the existing institutions, and then the Jewish Emergent Network, those communities a decade ago or so were sort of operating among people that were sort of, just outside of that circle, and now their having succeeded opens up an adjacency right next to that circle? Or is it possible that you're even out even further than that and saying, no, somehow the fact of seeing the adjacent movement of the emergent network and other innovations opens up the realization that we can go far outside of there and even take some chances on groups that are not in any way adjacent to the existing connected groups?
I kind of see it as a cantilevered bridge, like a suspension, like a suspension bridge that's still in the midst of being constructed, right? Where there's enough physics and enough hard work that gets you kind of way leaning out over an unknown. And so I think that, and this is, again, only my perspective, I'd be really interested to hear how the four rabbis would place themselves on that visualization. But, I see, folks like Dan Horowitz, let's say, in Detroit, who is really adjacent to the institutional work that's been done in the past, right? So he's maybe a little closer to the cliff that we're hanging off of, in some architecturally sound ways, I hope. And then, we've got Dan Ain, who is, in my opinion, kind of way out there on that cantilever bridge, in that he is producing an experience-based community that the Jewish world, kind of sees as programming experiences or educational experiences, but not Judaism. But it's the farthest, because I think he, or maybe, Ari Mafik is another interesting but different example, right out there on the edge. And so I think that those two, Ari and Dan Ain, I would say, are kind of out there on that cantilevered bridge pretty far, challenging us to expand our understanding of the words community and spirituality when they have to carry the weight of the word Jewish.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I don't know, I feel like I'm now sort of over my head in terms of physics and engineering, so I'm not even sure exactly what we're talking about with the bridge. But I am imagining, right, sort of almost like building a bridge. I don't know how bridges are actually built, but, coming towards the middle from two directions. And it's a really helpful image for me, because I think that a lot of the time when we talk about really out there innovation that's going out to what the people's needs are and what the people's desires are, there's often a critique that comes from those on the inside of the institutions that says, like you said, like things like, well, how is that Judaism? And where's the connection? And the expectation is almost like if you're moving in a recognizable way from where we are towards somewhere else, then we can at least follow the track from here to there. But if you're starting way out there in the world of the people that are so far away, maybe they're not even Jewish. And the image that I think you're raising that's so helpful to me is saying, and a bridge is sort of being built in both directions. And so, until they come and meet in the middle, we don't necessarily recognize it as a single span. But that's not a reason to deny the possibility that it will become a single span, and then we'll have a lot of travel in both directions.
If you're inside the institution, sometimes you think it's a bridge to nowhere. I think the difference is when it comes back, Lex, to what we were talking about, like bravery, is that these entrepreneurs believe enough to just leap, right? To build a bridge to somewhere, not knowing where somewhere is. And one of the things that this question of when is it not Judaism, Dan, I think you and I have talked about this before. It gets under my skin a little, mostly because I think the answer is it's never not Judaism. Forgive the kind of double negative there, but it's never not Judaism because there's never been a Judaism. There have been a lot of interesting Judaisms. I would probably argue that right now across the country there are a lot of interesting Judaisms being practiced simultaneously, right? But to think that there is this monolithic thing that we are, with respect to everyone out there who might not agree, it's to miss one of the fundamental messages of Jewish history.
You've done a really good job thus far in the conversation of elevating the people that are doing this work in their local communities. But I'd love to hear, okay, so they're in Detroit and in Brooklyn and in Berkeley, and they're doing their awesome work. And they may or may not be doing that work without you. But certainly by the sound of it, they're doing it more effectively and with a sense of fellowship and connection to these other communities as a result of what you've started to build with Open Door. So I'd love to hear about what's Open Door, like what does it look like when you're with these incredible people that have their independent communities, but you're also building this something between them, this shared sort of, I don't know if it's a movement, lowercase m, or if it's and whatever, you tell me, like, what does it look like when you're connecting these folks to each other and to create a shared sense of purpose?
So it really spans the gamut in terms of just making sure that they continue to have their personal spirits refreshed to do the work. And then we have joint calls that we share together to kind of bring group needs to the fore or certain trends in because folks talk to each other as well during any given month. So to bring whatever group needs have kind of trended to the top that we might be able to help with. And then when it comes to the individual support, we also we become an extension of the team. So we've helped our cohort members do everything from hunt down the right fiscal sponsorship to trying to find general liability insurance and the right coverage for the different kinds of programs and experiences that these communities put forward, helping make sure that the communication of their vision is happening at a high level. So if we can help, get a web project to the end stage or something that they need along those lines in terms of communication, we do that. We help folks research and figure out how to track their metrics. We live in a world where telling a data-driven story is important for raising funds. And so I think Jewish spiritual work is a whole other conversation, but I think Jewish spiritual work, just doesn't exist without the philanthropic support and generosity of so many folks around this country. But to be able to tap that, you need to be able to tell a story that's backed up by data. And so we help, figure that out, both with Tobin Belzer's help and also just with learning from each other. Hey, what system are you using? Oh, we're using a mix of, Eventbrite and such, or we're using a standalone system called, such and such. And that's how, you get to this place where at the end of the convening that we had in December, I remember folks saying, I feel less alone, mostly because I feel like I've got 5 partners now instead of 1. Right? Like that you guys are invested in my success.
I think that what you're talking about in your description is sort of an implicit theory of what's needed, right? And so, what are the missing elements in terms of supporting this kind of work? And, I've heard a bunch, but I'm curious sort of what you have seen as kind of the driving needs, because obviously there's a need for money and you supply a generous amount of money. There's obviously a need for not to be lonely and you're supplying that. What are the other sort of needs that you think are unmet by almost, other than you, and other than the 1-8 Foundation sort of seeing the value in this? Like, what would you wish was sort of much more widely recognized? And let's say Jewish federations each had a Open Door project kind of operation. Like, what would need to be going on there?
Well, look, you've already said it, and so, but I will say it briefly because it bears repeating. Entrepreneurs need money, frankly, and they need good portions of it. And mostly that is the case because it goes all back to the bravery and the risk. There is a position in the entrepreneurial world that says, hey, bootstrapping is good for you. And I think that that's actually very true. There's a point where it stops building character and starts destroying promising organizations. And so I think those open doors, those theoretical open door projects or whatever it is they would call them, would have a high risk tolerance. So that's one thing. There's a higher risk tolerance than we currently have. Insider Jewish life, designed by insiders for insiders, will serve only insiders. The ability to look outside our traditional portfolios and see dreams worth investing in to help others who aren't like us is something that is a kind of a foundational launching point for a project like ours. So the funny thing is, I've just noticed that I haven't listed anything in particular that is an infrastructure thing, right? What I listed for you so far was the ability to take risk and invest in dreams, right? And the ability to send a message to the dreamers that you value their dreams. That they may not be your dreams. They may not be the way you would, sketch a two-dimensional quick sketch of a Jewish spiritual community. It may not be your sketch, but that, their sketch and their visions are adding to an overall moving forward of what Jewish spirit can mean. And then, as you already mentioned, funding is important. Investing in the spiritual, personal, and professional development of each of these visionary entrepreneurs is important. But I think it's the fundamental cultural perspectives that I first talked about that are probably the lead changes that need to happen.
Well, George, you personally have such an interesting story as to how you got from where you started, both personally and professionally, how you got from there to here. And I'd love it if you could share a little bit of that story. And I wonder how it connects to what you're actually doing with all this and how you have the insight that you do.
So how do you become a Hispanic-born Jew by choice who becomes a rabbi and then runs a thing like Open Door? It's a long story, as it probably sounds, but I'll try to give you the quick version. So I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, and my mom's from Guatemala, and my dad was a first-generation American, which is where I get the crazy last name that nobody knows how to pronounce. And so, I grew up really for the first 10 years of my life in, fairly tough situation, as many first generation, my mom's the first gen to immigrate to the U.S. So as many families of folks who have made that brave choice, sometimes have, where my parents, their union didn't last very long. And so my mom was essentially a single mom my entire life, with the exception of 2 or 3 years. And, the first 10 years of our life, we lived in Section 8 housing, just northwest of the county city line in Baltimore. And so, we had a tough existence going early on. And then my mom did this amazing thing. She, saved up a ton of money. She was a housekeeper by trade all her life, still, retired a housekeeper just a little bit ago to Florida. So she's interested in living a vicarious Jewish dream. Even though she mostly helped keep Jewish houses clean all those years. But now she's, hanging out with the same folks in Florida. So she saved all her money and she moved us to a Jewish neighborhood. In the middle of the year, she moved us to, she didn't know it was an all Jewish neighborhood. All she knew was she had bought the nicest, smallest house in a nice neighborhood, in a great school district, that kind of thing. And instantly all of my friends and social circles were Jewish. I dated only Jewish girls. I did the B'nai Mitzvah circuit when the time came as the years progressed. But most importantly, I was invited into Jewish homes. Shabbat happened and Pesach Seders happened and got exposed to these amazing models of life and community that for me, growing up in a single parent household where my mom was always out, and thankfully so, I don't want to say this is, my mom's like one of my heroes, but thankfully always out making sure we had food and shelter and all the basic needs covered. These were family models that from the outside, every Jewish family was like the family from The Incredibles. They all had like special powers, just that, they were wonderful, giving, loving people who had this magical thing that they did, right? They lit candles at a certain time and that changed something about the space, or they blessed their kids, or they what was that? They blessed their kid, or they had like this whole set of, it's almost like Harry Potter falling into that world or something, right? Where there's this whole other culture. And, you get like a magic wand and your set of books and your robes. But for me, it was, seeing people light Shabbat candles and bless their children and sitting at a Passover Seder for the first time. And those things were just, they blew my mind. And then skip forward to the B'nai Mitzvah season. And I'm sitting in shul for the first time listening to Hebrew. And I laugh like a young, immature kid might, hearing a very guttural language chanted for the first time. And then I started listening. and I've been listening ever since. And so fast forward a bunch of years, I get into the life relationship that would really define me. My wife Allison and I meet in our early teens in high school, and we spend all of our formative teenage college years together. Her dad happens to be the executive director of one of the larger conservative synagogues in the country in Baltimore. And so now even more so, Jewish community becomes a part of my life. So I find myself, in volunteer roles, building the first computer lab at, Synagogue XYZ, or, sitting at the security desk on weekends, helping out when I need a little extra cash or whatever, but also learning the whole time. So the first woman who, taught me how to decode Hebrew letters was part of that community. And eventually the woman who taught me to learn Torah was part of that community. And I'm just a kid on the side. I'm not Jewish. I didn't claim any Jewish identity except for the one I was living, right? Like I made no official claims, but I was the 16, 18, 20-year-old who wasn't Jewish, but like kept the Yom Kippur fast. And then eventually there came a time where I didn't want to sit on the sidelines. People always think it was, my relationship with Allison, my wife, right? My now wife had progressed and we were going to get married, and he converted for the wedding. So I began my conversion essay with the sentence, I'm not converting for my wife. I'm not converting for the shul. I'm converting for me. I think embracing spiritual life is an adult thing. Not that the seeds can't be planted when you're young, but I think ultimately you're such a different person by the time that you are eagerly seeking to edify your soul. I think folks who truly, align with a tradition or multiple traditions tend to find that they're more fully formed adults when they do that and when they do it seriously. And so it was my choice. It was my choice, and I'm proud of that choice, and it's changed the trajectory of my life. And I was a film and communications major by trade, and so I was, one of the few guys who knew how to cut film on a Steinbeck. If anyone knows what that is out there, it's an old flat table that you used to use for editing traditional film, and also could, cut on a Media 100 or an Avid, right? And that was in the days where things were really making transition into digital content. And so I found myself, straight out of school, both along the way, kind of producing some native digital stuff. With a filmmaking partner, I had a film in the 2001 Maryland Film Festival, and I became a regular producer, both film and television, and then wound up working for a digital content startup. And then that transitioned me into kind of a sideline in another startup in the food business, believe it or not, that I did for some years. Pattern developed. I was always employee number, sometimes one, but mostly on 2, 3, very early, where it was just a makeshift conference space or a coffee shop trying to bring something to life. And that was my professional journey as my Jewish journey kept going at night. And I would audit Hebrew at the Baltimore Hebrew University, which is the local graduate school in town that focused on Jewish learning, go to private tutors for Hebrew, that kind of stuff, continue my study with a rabbi and mentor and wonderful friend, Rabbi Steve Schwartz, in Baltimore. And then eventually the two paths came together. There was a moment when it looked like I was going to, make an exit from a startup that I was working on, a software startup I was working on, and where I said to myself, I don't know if I want to, I don't know if I want to do that again right now. Bring something into being from the ground up is such a particularly hard road. It's a wonderful road with lots of rewards, but it's also very difficult and challenging emotionally. So I said, well, I have this thing for Judaism. And I'm good with Latin. I can speak fluent Spanish. I'm good with gendered language. I learn languages quickly. And I love the tradition of the text. So very long story, my apologies to both of you. Long story short, those two things came together when I first sat down with my wife and said, I'm thinking about doing this crazy thing in my prime earning years. Do you love me enough to do it together? Which luckily she does. She did. Or I guess she does. I hope. I applied to rabbinical school and was accepted. And that's how a tech executive becomes a rabbi.
That's beautiful. I really want to say that before jumping to the next question, because I just really appreciate you sharing your story. But I want to, in closing, ask a question that sort of comes full circle towards something you alluded to at the very beginning. And it was like a little detail, but I noticed it and I wanted to approach that before we went, which was, you mentioned that for the time being, this is rabbis and cantors, but down the line, maybe it'll be all sorts of different kinds of spiritual leaders. And I would love to hear more about that, because so you are a rabbi and I'm coming at this as somebody in rabbinical school, but I think that there is a need out there for. So like when I think about those different steps on the towards the bridge to nowhere that we were talking about, there's like the most adjacent and then there's the Dananes, and we talked about all that. Like to me, there's like a way out there that's like not even rabbis, just, everyday folks that are throwing around their Torah in interesting ways too. And like, I don't know if that's more distant or more adjacent, but it's interesting to me. And I guess I'd love to hear from you, like, it's probably early to even begin to think about this, but what do you think about when you consider the idea that there could be more and more of these cohorts coming together, and that some of them would not just be rabbis and might be pushing the envelope and pushing the boundaries of what we think of as Jewish authority in ways that could be exciting?
Yeah. It's actually because I walk the path of the traditional methodology towards training, or at least the one of the versions of traditional rabbinic training in this country. I'm really grateful for that experience, right? That experience was, and as I'm sure you can attest to, like one of the most intense and important personal formation experiences, potentially the most important outside of my life partnership, with my wife, Allison. So I don't say what I'm about to say lightly. So all of that being said, and all the asterisks put forward and all that stuff, one of the things that I think that just rabbis in the field know, one of the things that institutions know, one of the things that David Siegelman found out when he was doing the research for this project early on, when this was kind of a glint of an idea for him, was that rabbis and cantors, but that folks align themselves with spiritual leaders that, generally speaking, the deepest connections come with spiritual leaders that kind of look and feel close to what they look and feel like. For a while now, the Jewish world was training leaders that either didn't look and feel like, the average folks that were trying to sit in the pews, or that just couldn't, for whatever reason, couldn't communicate that they in fact had the same, as I'm sure they did, of course, the same human needs to be met through this tool that we call Judaism. But that somehow the traditional methodology of how you present and, this idea of rabbis as gatekeepers and rabbis as a certain models of a certain type of life and all those ideas that are put forward in your training. I think it was hard to put forward leaders, frankly, that a changing population would groan past that model where they needed rabbis as poseks, as opinionators of Jewish law, or rabbis as models of ideal Jewish lives, or rabbis as gatekeepers of a certain authentic Judaism. I feel like our people have moved way past that, and our rabbis haven't. And the institutions that train our rabbis haven't. And so that's why I think you see a misalignment now. So this is all to say that other forms of spiritual leadership are doing exceptional work right now. And they are, frankly, bringing connection that many official folks with certain titles either aren't bringing, or in some ways, with all respect, can't bring to this particular group of people. This group that is, again, defined as less connected or unaffiliated or whatever you want to say. But that, there's a communicator for every person and style, right? And I think that the traditional model of communicator and teacher served a wonderful purpose for a long time, but now the population has moved past that model. And then we're in this space where there's a transition for some rabbis who can make that change. And then, frankly, there's an opportunity in an open space for the leaders that many of which don't have any titles, which what they do have is a gift of human presence and spirit, and they know how to put it forward. I think we ignore that at our own peril, and I think we'd be foolish to ignore it. Jewish authority, Jewish teachers, Jewish life is rapidly changing, and there will be a space, and I think a growing and needed space for folks who might not carry traditional ordination or titles, but who are building communities that are changing people's lives. And if we cut that off, then I don't think we stand for what we think we stand for. Like I said, I was a kid on the outside, and somebody said to me it was worth their time to open this wisdom up to me. It's worth our time to embrace new models of teacher and leader and to open up this wisdom as wide as we can. I think we've been scared for a long time that we would be seen as proselytizers or some, all the things that unfortunately have had negative impacts on our communal lives. But back to our beginning, this is a moment to be brave.
I love just closing with that call for bravery. It's so important and on so many levels. So thank you for joining us for this conversation, George. It's been a really, really good one.
Thank you so much. I can't tell you how much I'm a fan of what you guys do. So Dan, you know how much of a fan you are. I'm thrilled to meet you. Thank you so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
And thanks, of course, also to you out there listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we want to close it out in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a few ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can head to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, we always love getting emails at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last plug we like to make is that you can always support us financially with either a one-time gift or a monthly recurring donation. And you can go with either of those at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.